The Great Wall of China. You can see it from space. It's this symbol of imperial power. But the foundation of that wall, it's built on something else. It's built on sacrifice, a huge amount of sacrifice. By the time we're done here, you won't just see a wall, you'll see a testament to what ambition costs. Millions of lives, those lives became the currency for building an empire's dream, and the echoes of that hardship, they're still here. They still shape how we see history, so there's a question in that. When a symbol of unity is made through that much loss, how do you measure it? What's the real cost of the monuments we look at? Qin Shi Huang was the first emperor. He had unified China. The warring states were finally brought together, but a new empire is fragile. To the north were the steppes. Nomadic tribes lived there. They moved like the wind. For them, the walled cities and farmlands of the south were a temptation, a target for raids. The emperor saw this threat. It could unravel everything he had built. His response was a statement carved into the earth. He would build a barrier, a permanent line between civilization and what he saw as chaos. This was the genesis, an act of supreme state power. The land itself would now serve the empire's will. To make this vision real meant mobilizing the entire population. On a scale never attempted, peasants, soldiers, convicts, hundreds of thousands of them, they received a decree. They were to report for labor. The northern frontier was rugged. Often desolate, it became a massive open-air factory, stretching for thousands of miles. Think about the logistics. This was over 2,000 years ago. No trucks, no cranes, no power tools. Every stone, every basket of earth, every wooden beam moved by human or animal muscle. Supply lines stretched to their breaking point. Trying to deliver food and tools to remote mountain passes, to arid deserts where nothing grew, the imperial bureaucracy was ruthlessly efficient in one regard. Meeting quotas, regional governors and military commanders were given sections to build, with deadlines and expectations. Their success, and likely their survival, depended on showing progress. The system prioritized the project's completion above all else, including the welfare of the people building it. This created a fundamental conflict. The state's need for security and symbolic power clashed with basic human needs: food, shelter, rest. It was within this gap between imperial decree and human limitation that suffering was guaranteed. And so we come to the first group, the ones who would pay the price for this grand vision, not with their taxes but with their lives. They came from the fields. They came from the prisons, from armies that had already lost. This wasn't a workforce of volunteers. It was an army conscripted by decree. The state needed bodies, a staggering number, and it found them among the people who couldn't say no. The backbone of the project were soldiers, peasants, convicts. Each group had its own story of hardship, long before they ever saw the frontier. For a peasant farmer, the order to report for labor was a sentence of ruin. They'd take him during planting season or the harvest, the exact moment his family's survival for the year was being decided. Him leaving meant his land went untended. It meant his wife, his children, his parents would face hunger without his labor. So the state's demand for a wall to protect the empire often guaranteed famine for the families inside it. The security of the whole was bought with the desperation of its parts, and then the convicts. That category was broad. It was actual criminals, but also prisoners of war from newly conquered lands, political dissidents, scholars who'd fallen out of favor. To the imperial administration, these people weren't citizens to protect. They were a resource to be used up. Their lives were expendable, useful only for the hardest, most dangerous work. A sentence to wall labor was a delayed death sentence. Everyone knew that. The moment of conscription was a rupture, a man got his orders, usually without warning. He'd gather a few things, say goodbyes he knew might be the last ones, and join a column marching north. He was walking away from being a father, a son, a farmer. He was becoming a number in a vast system. His value was now just how much earth he could move, how many stones he could lift. The human cost started right there, in that moment of severance. The emotional fabric of whole communities was torn apart to weave the physical fabric of the wall, and for these men, the journey was just the start. The real trial was waiting at the edge of the known world, in a landscape that wasn't ready for any of it. The northern frontier was dust and rock and wind. For a laborer just arriving, the scale of it didn't make sense. It was a scar on the earth, and it was full of men, thousands of them, all moving to the same rhythm. Your day started before the sun came up, and it ended long after it went down. There were no weekends, no rest. The work itself was brutal. Men hauled huge stones on wooden sleds, ropes cutting into their shoulders. They tamped earth into ramparts, heavy rammers going up and down, that same exhausting motion. Their tools were simple, iron and wood. Their bodies were the only engines. And the overseers were soldiers under their own pressure from commanders, and they enforced a strict system. Quotas were everything. Your ration, your spot in the shelter, whether you avoided punishment, it all depended on moving a certain amount of earth each day. You couldn't fall behind. The punishments for that, for laziness, they were severe. They were public. They were meant to motivate through fear. And that constant pressure, it turned the whole site into a kind of machine, and the fuel was human endurance. The environment was hostile. In summer, the sun beat down and dehydration was a constant threat. In winter, the wind came howling off the steps, freezing your hands to the tools. There was no real shelter, just lean toss or holes dug into a hillside, and then there were the quiet dangers. A rope could snap. A multi-ton stone could crash down a slope. A trench could collapse just like that. Exhausted men, their focus gone from fatigue, they made mistakes with heavy loads. These accidents, they were common. They were almost routine, a statistical certainty with that many tired people in that dangerous a place. But the biggest threat wasn't the dramatic accident. It was the slow grinding down of the body. The food, when it came, was often spoiled grain or thin gruel, barely enough for a child, let alone a man doing this work. Clean water was a fantasy. Streams near the sites got contaminated fast from the waste of thousands, and they became places for illness. There were no doctors. No medicine. A simple cut could fester. A stomach illness from bad water could weaken a man until one morning he just didn't get up. The worksite was a place where the line between life and a final rest was worn thin. Worn thin by toil and hunger and a complete absence of care. And this cycle, it stripped away more than strength. It eroded hope. A man could lose his identity here. He became just another pair of hands, another back bent against the mountain. His past life, his family, whatever dreams he had, it all faded into a haze of dust and pain. The wall grew, stone by stone, earth by earth, but it grew at the expense of the people building it, and moving through all this, through the exhaustion, more deadly than any overseer's whip, was an invisible force. A force that would end up claiming more builders than any rockfall ever could. The danger on the frontier wasn't something you could see, it was in the water. In the air, in the way men slept so close together at night. Disease was always there. Every stone they laid, it was there with them, and the camps were built for it, really. They were perfect for illness. Men slept packed into dugouts, into shelters, their breath all mixed in that cold, damp air. There was no sanitation. Waste went into pits. Those pits seeped into the ground, and the streams they drank from were downstream from those same pits. Nobody knew about germs. That idea was thousands of years away. So no one understood why men got sick. They just did, and it happened fast. A man could wake up with a fever. by that night he might be too weak to stand. We know the names now: dysentery from the bad water, it drained the fluids right out of you; typhoid, another one from the water; high fever, delirium. Then the respiratory infections, pneumonia, in the winter especially, they'd race through the barracks. A cough could become a death rattle in a few days. And this wasn't just sometimes, it was constant. An epidemic could move through a camp, leave half the men unable to work. A lot of them never came back from it. And the state, their response to this invisible thing, it was a calculation, a brutal one. A sick worker wasn't productive, so medical care, it wasn't there. No field hospitals, no doctors for the labor crews. At most, a sick man might be moved, put in a separate hut, isolated, to die alone, so his sickness wouldn't spread to the men who could still work. More often, though, he was just left where he was until he got better, or he didn't. The managers saw illness as a logistics issue, not a human one. They factored in a loss, a percentage. They knew for every 1,000 men sent out, only a fraction would live to see the project finished. That attrition was in the plan. It was a cost, the cost of doing business on that scale, but the real cost, it was paid quietly, watching a friend shiver with fever, knowing there was nothing you could do. The toll on the ones who survived, having to step over bodies in the morning, then go right back to lifting stones. That weight was immense. It created a numbness, a hardening just to get through the day. The wall took physical labor, but it took a piece of a man's spirit too. And that grind, that feeling of being a disposable part in a huge machine, it didn't just breed despair. Sometimes it sparked a different thought, a desperate one. What if you stopped? What if you walked away from the mountain, from the overseer, from the empire itself? For some, that thought became the act, the rebellion. The silence between those stones tells another story, not about broken bones but broken wills. You could see the physical toll. But the psychological burden was quieter, a deeper kind of erosion. Think about that horizon. You wake up, and the wall just stretches out in both directions, further than you can see, and your job is to make it longer every single day for years. There's no parole date, no promise you'll ever go home. The work is your entire existence, and the end of it is just a rumor. That creates a specific hopelessness, the despair of an infinite task. You're not building a wall, you're an ant moving one grain of sand on a beach that never ends. And the separation was a constant wound. These men had families, wives, children, parents waiting for them. With no way to send word, no news from home, your mind would race. Was the harvest good? Was everyone healthy? Had they forgotten you? The loneliness was absolute. You were surrounded by thousands of men, and you could feel completely alone. Trapped in your own thoughts about a life slipping away without you. Then there was the fear, not just the overseer's lash, but the world outside the worksite. Raiders from the steppes could strike anytime. You were building a fortification, but you were outside of it, exposed. Any shadow on the ridge at dusk could be the last thing you ever saw. And maybe the most corrosive thought was a moral one. For many conscripts, especially from the borderlands, the lines were blurry. The people this wall was meant to keep out, they weren't abstract monsters. They might be distant cousins, traders you once knew, people who spoke a language you understood. You're building a barrier that might one day kill someone from your own homeland. Or if you were ever captured, this same wall would stand between you and home. You're building the instrument of your own potential imprisonment. That kind of dissonance, building your own cage, it eats at a person's soul. We hear echoes of this, not in imperial records, but in the people's own voices. Folk songs and poems passed down. They're full of longing and loss. A wife gazing north, waiting for a husband who never returns. A laborer comparing his life to a leaf torn from a tree. There's a famous ballad about Meng, Jiangnü, a woman who travels to bring winter clothes to her husband at the wall. She arrives and learns he's already dead, his body lost within the stones. Her grief is so powerful, they say, that a section of the wall collapses and reveals his remains. That's not just a love story, it's a cultural memory, a collective cry against the machinery of the state. It says the deepest cost was measured in tears, not just tons of earth. This mental landscape of fear, isolation, and moral injury was the true climate of the frontier. A cold no fire could warm. A man could survive the hunger, push through the exhaustion, but this despair could break him from the inside. His spirit could give out long before his body did. He might just stop trying, become a ghost moving stones, or he might make that desperate choice to rebel against the mountain itself. And when that happened, the empire's response was uncompromising. It was designed to send a message, not just to the man who ran, but to every laborer watching. The geography they fought against would become the stage for a final lesson. The mountains didn't care about empires. An emperor could command 1,000,000 men, but he couldn't command the rock. The wall's path was a line drawn for defense, a strategic choice laid over a brutal geography. It was a choice that sent builders into the teeth of the land itself. They weren't just building a barrier, they were waging a war against the terrain. The first challenge was the verticality. To follow the high ridges, they had to climb them. Men carried stones up slopes so steep they needed ropes just to keep their footing. The air grew thin, headaches pounded, nausea and dizziness, what we'd call altitude sickness now, would sap a laborer's strength long before his shift was done. A misstep on a narrow ledge meant a long fall into silence. The mountains demanded a toll just for being there. Then the path would drop. It plunged into the western deserts. Here, the enemy was the sun. It baked the earth into a hard, cracked plate. Heat rose in visible waves, distorting the horizon. There was no shade, only the glare. The risk of heat stroke was constant. A man could be working, feel a sudden dizziness and collapse. Without immediate help, that was often fatal. Water was a treasure more precious than gold. Every drop had to be carried in over vast distances. Thirst was permanent, your lips cracked, your throat felt like dust, and the sand itself was a torment. It got into everything: food, tools, eyes, lungs. It wore down leather and dulled metal. It abraded human skin. Building in the desert meant fighting a landscape that actively sought to bury your work, and you with it. Further north, the challenge shifted again. The steppes in winter. This was a cold that felt alive, a wind that sliced through layers of clothing like they weren't there. Frostbite was a creeping horror. It started as a numbness in the fingers or toes, a whitening of the skin. If you were lucky, you might lose a nail. If not, the tissue would die, turning black. Infection would set in. Surviving a shift meant constantly moving, trying to keep blood flowing to your extremities, even as exhaustion begged you to stop and rest. To rest in that cold was to not wake up. The ground froze solid, making it nearly impossible to dig foundations. Men had to light fires on the rock-hard earth to thaw it just enough to break the surface. The logistics of these environments were a nightmare. Moving a single granite block from a quarry to a ridgetop miles away required an army of men, sleds, rollers. They built ramps of earth and timber, temporary roadways that consumed as much labor as the wall itself. A supply caravan bringing grain to a desert outpost could be lost to a sudden sandstorm. A mountain path, carefully cleared, could be washed away by a single rainstorm, taking workers with it. The land's indifference was absolute. A rockslide, a flash flood, a blizzard. These weren't tragedies to the environment. They were just weather, but to the builders they were catastrophes. They could erase weeks of work and hundreds of lives in an instant. This forced a grim ingenuity. You used what the land gave you. In the mountains, you quarried the local stone. In the grasslands where stone was scarce, you rammed layer upon layer of local earth, mixed with gravel and straw to create ramparts of rammed earth. In the go-by desert, they sometimes used layers of sand and gravel bound with tamarisk branches. this wasn't elegant engineering, it was survival building. It was the adaptation of desperate people to a world that offered no concessions. Every material choice whispers of that struggle. The wall isn't just a line on a map. It's a physical record of a conversation between human will and an unforgiving earth. A conversation where the price of every mile was paid in exhaustion and exposure. And overseeing all of this monumental effort was a system, a bureaucracy of stone and sorrow. It was this system that transformed the landscape's natural cruelty into a calculated outcome. The wall's substance tells its own story. It wasn't built from a single plan with uniform materials brought in from some central warehouse. It was built from whatever the land offered. A forced marriage between human need and local geology. On the flat, loess-rich plains, the wall rose as a giant mound of rammed earth. Workers dug massive trenches, sometimes right through existing farmland to get the right soil. They'd layer it in wooden frames, mixing it with gravel and straw. Teams of men would pound it for days with heavy wooden rammers until it hardened like stone. This technique created the wall, but it also erased the fields that fed the people. The very act of securing the border could destroy a village's means of survival. In the mountains, the material changed to stone. This meant quarries. Men would wedge wooden pegs into cracks in the rock face, then pour water on them. The wood would swell slowly, prying the stone free, or they'd heat the rock with fire and then dash cold water on it, causing it to crack. Both methods were slow. Unpredictable, a section of cliff face weakened by this work could give way without warning, burying the crew beneath tons of rubble. Each block they pried loose was a gamble with the mountain itself. Then came the transport. A single multi-ton block had to be moved. They'd roll it on logs, drag it with ropes, haul it up earthen ramps that took weeks to build. The journey from quarry to construction site was a gauntlet of strained muscles, snapped ropes, crushed limbs, and in the deserts, where neither good earth nor stone was available, they got creative. To the point of desperation, they used what they found, bundles of reeds or tamarisk branches layered with sand and gravel. It was a fragile barrier, more symbolic than strong, but it still had to be built. The procurement of every material, from the sturdiest granite to the flimsiest reed, was a separate saga of toil. The binding agent itself holds a contradiction. In some of the most enduring sections from later dynasties, they used a special mortar, made from slaked lime, but with a secret ingredient, glutinous rice flour. This sticky rice paste mixed into the mortar created a bond so strong it could survive centuries of weathering, even earthquakes. It was a brilliant innovation. A testament to ancient engineering genius, but think about the source. Glutinous rice was a food crop, in an era where famine was a constant threat, and the laborers on the wall were perpetually underfed. Precious agricultural resources were being diverted. Rice that could have filled a hungry man's bowl was instead being cooked into paste to hold stones together. The wall's strength literally came from the mouths of the people building it. This is the quiet, systemic cruelty of the project. The empire's priority was permanence, not people. So when you look at a photograph of the Great Wall snaking over a ridge, you're not just looking at a defensive structure. You're looking at a colossal mosaic of local suffering. That gray stone was pried from a cliff by men who feared it would fall on them. That brown earth was packed by families who lost their fields to the trench it came from. The very stuff of the wall, from its foundation to its binding, is saturated with the effort of those who had no choice. It is a monument made of their labor, their resources. By extension, their lives. This transformation of human effort into an immortal symbol was not an accident. It was the result of a management system that viewed people as a renewable and ultimately expendable resource. The overseers on the ground were the sharp end of that system, tasked with turning imperial ambition into physical reality, no matter the human price. The control system was built as carefully as the wall. You had thousands of desperate men on a site. Simple orders weren't enough, so they used a currency of fear. The overseers were the ones who minted it. These overseers were usually low-ranking soldiers, men who were also far from home. They were under their own pressure from commanders above them. They had impossible deadlines. Their survival, their position, depended on getting a certain amount of labor each day. That pressure moved down the chain. From the emperor to the general to the captain, and then to the man holding the whip, he became the physical form of the state's demand. His tools were simple and brutal. The lash was common. If you didn't meet your daily quota of moved earth, if you were seen resting at the wrong time, a broken tool, any of that could mean a public whipping. The point wasn't just to punish that one man. It was a performance for the whole crew. The crack of the whip, the cries, they were a reminder that your body wasn't your own. That your pain didn't matter compared to the wall's progress. More serious offenses were different. Theft of rations, trying to escape, those could bring much worse. Beatings happened. There are accounts from later, from folk memory, of mutilation, losing a hand or a foot for stealing, losing an ear for insolence. This was psychological warfare. It marked a man for good, turned him into a walking warning for everyone else, and for the worst crime, organizing a rebellion or a successful escape, the punishment was death. Often done publicly in a gruesome way, meant to paralyze the whole workforce with terror. That atmosphere changed the social fabric of the camp. Trust disappeared. In a place where your neighbor's mistake could bring punishment for everyone, and where reporting someone might get you a slightly bigger ration, everyone became a potential informant. You couldn't complain about the hunger or the cold or the overseer. You couldn't voice a plan or a dream of home or a moment of doubt. Those words could be traded for an easier job, for a bowl of thicker gruel. It turned the workforce against itself. Shared hardship that might have created solidarity instead created suspicion. Isolation, it was a brilliant strategy, a cruel one. By making every man afraid of his neighbor, the overseers stopped any unified resistance from forming. The real prison wasn't just the distant mountains or the endless work. It was the silence between the men, a silence kept in place by the constant, watching threat of the whip. This culture of fear was efficient. It moved stones, it met quotas, but the cost was the complete dehumanization of everyone inside it. The laborer became a unit of production. The overseer became an instrument of pain, his own compassion stripped away by the system that used him. Even the act of punishment lost its moral weight. It became routine, administration. A foreman noting a deficit in the earth moved, ordering 10 lashes, then moving to the next tally sheet. The violence wasn't passionate. It wasn't angry, it was cold, bureaucratic, and that made it more terrifying. And for the ones who didn't survive, this dehumanization followed them past their final moment. When a laborer fell to illness or exhaustion or punishment, how he was treated in death showed his value in life. There was no ceremony, no sending remains back to a home village. No marker with his name. The priority was to remove a health hazard and get back to work. The common practice, from what archaeology and accounts suggest, was a simple burial near the worksite. Sometimes in a shallow, unmarked pit, sometimes within the wall's own foundation, or its fill. His body, like the stones and earth he moved, became literal building material. His final resting place was the barrier he helped create. So the wall isn't just a structure they built. For countless thousands, it's the structure they became. Their physical remains are woven into it, an eternal, silent testament to the price of its existence. That change from person to part of the monument is maybe the most profound cost. It raises a haunting question about legacy. When history celebrates an achievement on this scale, whose story is actually being told, and whose memory is sealed inside the stone. The silence of an unmarked grave is different. It's a silence that speaks of erasure, For a laborer who died on the frontier, there was no procession home. No family to wash the body, no incense at an ancestral altar. The project's demands, the sheer number of losses, made traditional rites impossible, so a practical solution emerged. A grim one, the body was often buried right where it fell, sometimes in a shallow pit scraped into the hard earth near the worksite, sometimes, and folklore says this, sometimes within the wall's own rising ramparts. His remains, like the stones and earth he moved, became building material, literal building material. That's where the saying comes from, that the Great Wall is built on bones. It's not just a metaphor, it's a folk memory of a literal truth. Archaeology gives us glimpses. The evidence is fragmented by time. Researchers have found remains near ancient wall sections. Not in organized cemeteries, in isolated, haphazard placements. The bodies are often found without grave goods, no pottery, no tools, no personal items for the afterlife. That absence is telling. In traditional practice, those items were essential, a sign of respect, a provision for the journey. Their absence here suggests a disposal. Not a ceremony, the positioning of the bones sometimes indicates haste, a body tucked into a foundation trench, covered quickly by the next layer of rammed earth. These aren't the careful burials of honored soldiers. They're the pragmatic actions of a system that saw a deceased laborer as a logistical problem, a problem to be solved and then forgotten. This practice tells you everything about the value placed on an individual life within that imperial machine. A man was a resource. When that resource was exhausted by illness, accident, punishment, it was discarded. As efficiently as a broken tool, his identity, his name, his home village, his dreams, none of it mattered to the project's ledger. He became anonymous. A statistic, that anonymity compounded the tragedy. Far beyond the frontier, back in his village, his family lived in suspended grief. Without a body to bury, without confirmation, they couldn't perform the rituals to settle his spirit. In the beliefs of the time, that meant his soul might be trapped, wandering, unable to join his ancestors. The family's loss was double. They lost a provider, a father, a son. And they lost the ability to care for his spirit, which was a profound duty, a cultural and emotional duty, so the wall's cost rippled invisibly through generations. Creating ghosts in a physical sense and a spiritual sense. The folk tales that grew from this are stories of unresolved longing. The most famous is the legend of Meng Jiangnü, the woman who journeys to bring winter clothes to her husband. She learns he has died, buried in the wall. Her weeping is so powerful, so full of grief, that it causes a section of the wall to collapse. It reveals his bones so she can finally give him a proper burial. That story isn't really about magical tears. It's a collective fantasy of justice. It's the people's answer to the state's anonymity. The story says that true human feeling, love and grief, is more powerful than the emperor's stone. It insists that an individual life must be acknowledged, that a name must be remembered. The wall falls before the force of personal loss. So when you hear that saying, built on bones, you're hearing a historical truth. Filtered through deep cultural pain, the wall is a marvel of engineering, but its foundations in many places are also a vast, unmarked memorial. It stands as a paradox, a symbol of collective strength and unity that is also a tomb for countless, nameless individuals. Their silence is built into its very fabric, which leads to a difficult question. If a monument's greatness is measured by its scale and endurance, how do you account for the scale of the silence it contains? The story doesn't end with the last stone laid. That silence, that weight of loss, would echo down the centuries, shaping the very soul of the nation the wall was meant to protect. A family's survival was a balance. A delicate one. Remove one weight and the whole structure could collapse, and conscription, taking a father, a husband, a son, that was the removal, the imperial decree that took a man to the frontier. It didn't just take a person, it took a provider, it took a farmer from his field at planting time, it took a craftsman from his workshop, the strongest arms gone from a household that depended on them. In that moment, a family's future was recalculated. The equation didn't balance. For the wife left behind, the burden was immense. She managed the farm alone now. The back-breaking work, plowing, sowing, weeding, harvesting tasks for multiple adults, all fell to her. Her children, if they were old enough, were pulled from any chance of schooling to work beside her. If they were too young, she worked with an infant on her back. The elderly parents she was now responsible for could offer little physical help. The yield from their land dropped. Inevitably, a good harvest might keep them on the edge of subsistence. A poor one meant hunger. It meant selling off a piece of land, the family's only inheritance, just to buy grain. It meant a slow slide into debt, and from debt into a different kind of servitude. The emotional toll was its own kind of labor. Every day lived with uncertainty. There was no postal service from the northern frontier, no news. A man could have been gone a year, 5 years. Was he alive? Was he ill? Had he already found his final rest in that distant soil? Families lived in a state of suspended mourning. They couldn't perform the rites without a body to honor. In the belief system of the time, this meant his spirit might be lost. Wandering, unable to join the ancestors, this unresolved grief was a shadow over daily life. A wife was neither truly married nor widowed. She was in a liminal space, bearing all the responsibilities of both roles with none of the social certainty. This crisis wasn't isolated to one cottage. It was replicated, village after village, province after province. The empire's demand for labor was a constant drain. It siphoned off the young and able-bodied men in waves. You can picture a community where, over a generation, the demographic landscape changed. The central square, once full of men in their prime, now had fewer of them. The faces you saw were increasingly the very old, the very young, and the women bearing burdens they were never meant to carry alone. The vitality of the place, its energy for festivals, for building projects, for defending itself, slowly seeped away. The village became quieter, poorer, more fragile. The economic impact was profound. With fewer men to work the land, total agricultural output across the empire likely suffered. This put upward pressure on grain prices, hurting everyone, but especially those families already struggling. Local economies stuttered. The carpenter wasn't there to fix a roof. The blacksmith was gone. The network of mutual aid that rural life depended on began to fray. Too many links in the chain were missing. Poverty became cyclical. A boy growing up in a household broken by conscription started life with fewer resources, less land, more debt. His prospects were dimmed before he ever had a chance. So the wall's cost was paid twice, first in blood and toil on the wind-swept frontier, then again in the quiet desperation of 1,000 silent hearths. The empire, seeking to fortify its external borders, was inadvertently weakening its internal fabric. It was consuming its own human capital, the farmers who fed the cities, the fathers who raised the next generation of taxpayers and soldiers. This was a national trauma, a slow bleed of social stability. The monument, meant to symbolize unity and strength, was, in its creation, a source of deep and widespread fragmentation. And this legacy of sacrifice, this immense price, would inevitably shape how the wall was remembered, not just by emperors in their chronicles, but by the people. Their songs and stories carried the real weight of history. The frontier soldier lived in two worlds, and neither one gave him rest. He was a builder in the morning, then a sentry by night. His identity was split by the very structure he was making. Conscripted laborers had a single, grinding purpose, but the garrison soldier carried a double burden. His official duty was defense, to guard the empire's northern line, but to do that, he first had to build the line itself, so his service became a cycle. Contradictory demands. He would spend 10 hours under the sun, muscles burning, lifting stones, fitting them into a rampart. Then, as dusk fell, he would take up his spear or his crossbow, his body already exhausted, and he would climb that same rampart to stand watch. His enemy was no longer the weight of the stone, it was the darkness beyond it. And whatever moved in that darkness, this duality eroded things. The distinction between military service and penal labor, there was little glory in it. No charging into battle on horseback, just the slow, aching construction of a barrier, followed by the tense, lonely vigilance to protect it. The strain was physical, but also psychological, deeply psychological. A soldier is trained for combat, for clear orders, for the adrenaline of engagement, for the cohesion of a unit acting as one. But the work of a builder is different. It's repetitive, monotonous, measured in feet of wall completed per day. To shift between these mindsets daily created a kind of whiplash. One day you're focused on the alignment of a cornerstone. The next you're scanning the horizon for raiders. Your body never fully recovered from the labor. So you began each watch already fatigued. Your reactions were slower, your focus dulled by the sheer physical drain of moving earth. It could lapse at the worst possible moment. The system was creating its own vulnerability. It was asking the same men to build the shield and then hold it up, while ensuring they were too tired to do either job well. Their mortality told the story, this impossible balance. They faced danger from every direction. In combat during a raid, they were the first line of defense. Often outnumbered, caught on a construction site that was only half fortified, but just as many were lost to the quiet perils of the worksite, likely more. The same accidents that claimed laborers claimed soldiers who were builders for the day. Rock falls, trench collapses, falls from scaffolding. Illness spread just as easily through their barracks. The rations were the same thin gruel. The medical care was just as absent. So a soldier's life was at risk from the enemy's arrow and from the infected blister on his hand. His service was a gamble with two sets of odds, and both were stacked against him. Morale suffered under this relentless grind. There's a certain spirit that comes from military camaraderie, from training for a shared, decisive purpose. But that spirit is hard to maintain when the shared purpose is moving a millionth basket of gravel. The unglamorous, endless labor chipped away at military pride. These men had signed up to be warriors or were conscripted to be warriors. They found themselves instead as manual laborers in uniform. The prestige of defending the empire was buried. Buried under the daily reality of blistered hands and aching backs. They could see no end to it. The wall needed constant maintenance. A section completed this year would need repairs in 3. Their service wasn't a campaign with a conclusion. It was a permanent state of toil. This bred a deep-seated resentment, a feeling of being used up by a distant court that saw them not as an army, but as a permanent, disposable workforce. This fusion of roles created a unique form of service, a profoundly taxing one. The battle against the steppe nomads was intermittent, but the battle against the environment, against exhaustion, against the soul-crushing monotony of the task, that was a constant siege. The wall was not just their post, it was their prison. Their workplace, the sum total of their military achievement. They were forever caught between the hammer and the anvil, building the very thing that defined the limits of their world. And as the dynasties changed, the wall's purpose would be reinterpreted. The fate of those who built it reinterpreted. Each new ruler layering new meanings over the old stones. And the old sorrows, Meng Jiangnü, it's a story that comes from a place of grief, a kind of cultural echo. A young woman travels north, she's looking for her husband. He was taken for labor, she's carrying winter clothes for him. That's the detail, a small act of care. She finally gets there, after all that hardship. And she learns he's gone, he died from the toil, his body was lost, built into the wall itself, so she weeps at the base of this structure. For days, and her sorrow, it's so powerful it moves heaven and earth. The stones can't bear it, a section of the wall cracks, then collapses, inside a jumble of bones. She finds a way to identify her husband, often a test with blood, and she gives him a proper burial. On the surface, a love story, loyalty and loss, but it's more. It's an act of memory and protest. Every piece means something. Meng Jiangnü isn't a noble, she's ordinary, a wife. She stands for every family broken by conscription. Her journey is the helplessness of those left behind, those winter clothes, a domestic concern, warmth, care, things the Imperial project ignored, the voice of the hearth against the voice of the state. The wall collapsing, that's the heart of it, the emperor's great achievement, undone, not by an army, by tears, one woman's grief. It says human emotion holds a power. Greater than stone, greater than decree. It's a fantasy of justice, where feeling forces the state to see a single stolen life, retrieving the bones for burial. That's the final reclaiming. It gives back identity, ceremony, to someone the system made anonymous. It mends a spiritual rupture, the story changed over time. In some versions, after the burial, she's taken to the emperor. He's struck by her beauty, her virtue. He proposes marriage, she agrees, but only if he performs full funeral rites for her husband first. He does it, then she denounces his cruelty and takes her own life, often by drowning. That version sharpens the critique. The emperor becomes hypocritical. Morally bankrupt, her final act is defiance, using his rituals against him to show his guilt, then choosing her own fate. This legend endured because it was necessary. Official histories recorded dates, dynasties, the length of walls. They celebrated engineering, military triumph. They were silent on the cost. Folk memory carried the other side. Stories like this gave a voice to the voiceless millions. They turned anonymous suffering into a named experience. They ensured the wall would never be just a feat of engineering. It would also be a site of sacrifice. This tale, told by mothers and grandparents, became the people's history, a counter-narrative, not on bamboo slips. In the collective heart, so hearing Meng Jiangnü now, it's not just a myth, it's an ancient cry for recognition, a reminder, behind every monumental achievement there are quiet stories. Of those who built, those who waited, those who wept. The legend makes sure the human cost is never fully buried by the glory. It lives on, a thread of memory, woven into a nation's fabric, and as centuries turned, this memory would shape how the wall was seen, its complicated legacy. Numbers can hide things. When you ask how many died building the Great Wall, you're asking the empire to count people it never counted. The records from the Qin and Han, they have numbers. They list conscripted laborers, lengths of wall, amounts of grain, but they don't have a final number for the ones who didn't come home. That silence is the first clue. The absence of a number tells you something about the value of a single life in that project. So historians have to work from fragments. A chronicle might mention a commander mobilizing 300,000 men for frontier work. An administrative scrap from the desert lists rations for a crew of 50. You look at the physical scale of it, thousands of miles built over centuries. The estimates that come out of this are broad, and they're staggering. Over all those centuries, from the Qin through the Ming, the range is several 100,000 to maybe 2 or 3 million people. It's not a single, neat figure. It's a vast, shadowy expanse. It's a testament to uncertainty. To get to that range, researchers use a kind of triangulation. They start with a known conscription number from a specific year under a specific emperor. Then they apply what we know about mortality rates in pre-industrial labor camps. Studies from other large projects give a grim benchmark. They factor in the duration of service, the environmental hazards, the lack of medical care. It becomes a summa calculation. If you send 100,000 men into the mountains for a year with bad food, rampant illness, and brutal labor, what percentage would die? The math points to a tragic, consistent outcome, but the reason we can't be more precise is built into the system. These laborers weren't soldiers who fell in a named battle. Their deaths weren't an event to commemorate. It was an operational loss, like a worn-out tool or spoiled grain. It was so routine it often went unrecorded. And the wall wasn't built in one campaign. It was built, neglected, rebuilt, and extended over 2,000 years by different dynasties. A Ming soldier falling from a scaffold in the 1500s is part of the same toll as a Qin convict dying of illness 2,000 years earlier. Their stories are separated by time but connected by the same immense undertaking. So the ambiguity of the number isn't a failure of research. In a profound way, it is the point. That range of estimates, from conservative to catastrophic, forces you to confront the scale. It tells you the loss wasn't a tragic accident, it was a systemic feature. The fact we have to speak in terms of hundreds of thousands or millions confirms this was a demographic event, a quiet, relentless drain on the empire's human resources. That numerical haze is the final form of the anonymity placed on the builders. Their identities were erased twice, first by the conditions of their labor and then by time. Yet even without a precise count, looking at it economically brings the cost into sharper focus. The wall was in the imperial budget, a huge line item. To see the real cost, you have to look past the stones. You have to see the ledger. The treasury didn't just pay for timber and tools, it paid for lives in a way. The whole project was a transfer of resources, a massive one. It took men from farms, from workshops. It took grain from the storehouses. It took iron from the forges. And all of it was sent north to the frontier. That wasn't an accident. It wasn't poor planning. That was the plan. The human cost wasn't a tragic side effect. It was a calculated input, a necessary expenditure for a strategic goal. In the cold logic of empire, the security from a permanent barrier was worth more than the lives it consumed. This was a macroeconomic decision on a staggering scale. You have to consider what was being moved and where it came from. Every laborer sent to the wall was a farmer not in his field. A blacksmith not making plows, a carpenter not building homes. Their productive capacity, their ability to help their own communities, was redirected. It was poured into the ground, transformed into a static, defensive structure. The food supply tells the same story. Feeding hundreds of thousands of men in remote places required a monumental effort. Grain was taxed from the southern provinces, loaded onto carts and barges, transported over vast distances, a huge portion spoiled, or was eaten by the drivers and guards moving it. It was a net drain on the empire's food surplus. Grain that could have fed cities during a famine or been stored for stability was instead consumed to sustain the project. The project that was removing farmers from the land. It created a vicious cycle. This leads to opportunity cost. It's an economic term, but the concept is simple. It's what you give up by choosing one path over another. By committing such a colossal part of its wealth and manpower to the wall, the empire chose not to invest those resources elsewhere. What might have been built instead? More irrigation canals to make farmland productive, to prevent hunger, grand libraries or academies, roads and bridges to connect the empire internally. To foster trade and unity, we'll never know. Those possibilities were stifled. Their potential energy was converted into the potential energy of a stone sitting on a ridge. The wall is a frozen investment, capital, human and material taken out of circulation, locked into a single, immovable asset. The decision makes a certain brutal sense from the throne's perspective. The primary duty of any state, especially a new one, is survival. External threats from the steppes were immediate, existential. A nomadic raid could destroy a season's harvest, destabilize a border region, challenge the emperor's mandate to protect his people. The wall was a long-term solution to that, a way to control geography, to dictate where conflict could happen. By building it, the state was buying security on credit, paying for it with the labor and lives of a generation. The calculus was that the empire secured would live on to produce more generations, more wealth, more glory. The individual was sacrificed for the collective future. As defined by the state, this reveals the wall's other function. Quieter, beyond defense, it was a tool of social control, population control, conscripting masses of men, especially from newly conquered or restless regions, served a dual purpose. It provided the labor force, but it also removed potentially troublesome men from the heartland. It dispersed them to the edges of the empire, where they were isolated, monitored, kept busy with backbreaking work. It was a way to neutralize internal dissent while fortifying the border. The project consumed human energy that might otherwise have been turned against the throne. In this light, the wall wasn't just keeping people out, it was also managing the people within. It was geography as administration. This pattern isn't unique. It's a recurring theme in the story of empires: the pyramids of Egypt, the Roman road network, the grand cathedrals of Europe. Many of humanity's most awe-inspiring monuments are also monuments to centralized power and its willingness to expend human capital. They are testaments to a specific kind of ambition, where the legacy of the state is etched into the landscape, paid for with the silent currency of countless ordinary lives. The Great Wall stands as one of the purest examples of this equation, a line where Imperial will met human cost. And the will, for a time, prevailed. But that legacy, written in stone and sorrow, would be judged differently by those who came after. The very symbol of unity became a reminder of division. A paradox that would echo through Chinese poetry and philosophy, through identity for centuries to come. The wall story isn't a single story, it's many stories layered together. Each dynasty in China faced the northern frontier, and each one left its own mark on the wall, and each one left its own record of human cost. To see the full scale of that sacrifice, you have to move through time. From its terrifying start under the first emperor to its final, iconic stone form under the Ming, the Qin dynasty's approach was shock and awe. Emperor Qin Shi Huang had just unified China through conquest. For him, the wall was an urgent, existential project. His method was conscription on a scale no one had seen. It came from a legalist philosophy, one that put state power above everything else. The labor was organized with military ruthlessness. Soldiers, convicts, peasants, they were all driven by deadlines and the constant threat of severe punishment. The goal was speed and scale, to create a continuous barrier as fast as possible. The human cost under the Qin was catastrophic, a concentrated burst of suffering. It entered folklore as the wall's foundational trauma. It was built with rammed earth and desperation, and its price was paid in one brutal generation. Then, centuries later, the Han Dynasty inherited the Qin's work and expanded it, but their context was different. The empire was more stable, more prosperous. They were engaged in active trade on the Silk Road, so the Han Wall wasn't a continuous barrier. It was more a network of fortified outposts and watchtowers. It was designed to protect trade routes and to launch campaigns into the steppes. The labor organization became slightly more systematic. Conscription and convict labor were still there, but there are records of paid laborers too. Soldiers serving rotations, the hardship didn't disappear. The frontier was still a deadly place, but the Han had a longer timeline and greater resources. That may have allowed for marginally better supply lines. The suffering was stretched over centuries, not condensed into a few terrible years. but it was suffering all the same. Then came the Ming, the dynasty that gave us the grand, stone-walled vision we know today. After expelling the Mongol Yuan dynasty, the Ming were obsessed with securing the border permanently. Their project was the most technologically advanced, the most architecturally sophisticated. They used stone blocks, brick facades, that famous mortar made with rice flour. This wasn't a rushed earthwork, it was a permanent, monumental statement. But did this advancement mean better conditions for the builders? In some ways, perhaps. The Ming had a professional, standing army. Much of the construction was done by military garrisons, soldier builders who lived at the wall, that provided a more stable life than the Qin's chaotic conscription camps. It was still harsh, specialized craftsmen were employed, but the scale was immense, the labor demands were unrelenting, soldier builders still faced deadly accidents, illness. The psychological grind of endless construction and watch duty. So the Ming system was more organized, but it was no less demanding of human life, over nearly 300 years of building and rebuilding. So did later dynasties learn. The evidence suggests they learned engineering, not empathy. Each era adapted the wall to its own strategic needs. The Qin needed a quick, intimidating line. The Han needed a flexible military corridor. The Ming needed an immortal symbol of their dynasty's might. And in each case, the political need of the ruling house dictated the project's form. The need to defend itself, to project power, to legitimize its rule. The human cost was a secondary calculation, a necessary input to achieve that political end. The methods of mobilization evolved, from outright terror to bureaucratic conscription to military duty, but the fundamental equation stayed the same. The state's security was purchased with the lives and labor of its people. This view over time reveals a sobering truth. The tragedy of the Great Wall wasn't a one-time event. It was a recurring feature of Chinese imperial history. Each dynasty used the wall to solidify its own power, and in doing so, each generation of rulers replicated a cycle of sacrifice. The stones changed, but the sorrow woven into them did not. This endless adaptation of the project across centuries ensured its survival as a world wonder. But it also guaranteed that its shadow, the shadow of its human cost, would stretch just as far across time, and that legacy, written in stone and story, would shape how the wall was remembered. Not as a mere fortification, but as something much more complex in the heart of Chinese culture. The wall wasn't always a monument. For a long time, it was a place of dread. A final sentence, a resting place for people who never came back. Its name was tied to loss, to ballads about widows, to empty hearths. It was a scar on the land and on memory itself. But centuries passed and a change happened. The structure born from suffering was recast. It began to stand for something else, not the pain of its making, but the endurance. The wall had survived. It weathered invasions, neglect, the rise and fall of dynasties. It stubbornly remained, and in that stubbornness, people saw a reflection of their own resilience. The story shifted from the cost of building it to the fact it was built at all, from individuals broken by the state to the collective will of a civilization that could achieve this. It became less about the stones laid down and more about the spirit that could conceive of laying them, a culture taking a source of trauma and reshaping it into strength. The focus moved from the builders to the built, from the process to the product. In modern China, especially the last century, this transformation was completed. The Great Wall became the ultimate emblem of national identity, on currency, in patriotic education, in speeches about unity, a testament to ancient ingenuity and determination. Physical proof of a continuous civilization that could overcome any obstacle. It's a powerful, unifying story, and it's not untrue. The engineering is magnificent. The scale is humbling, but in this celebration of the collective, the individual stories fade. the millions of specific human costs, they become a vague shadow. A necessary price paid long ago for the security and legacy we have now. That creates a tension, a monument that is both a tomb and a trophy, where national pride is built on a foundation of profound personal sorrow. It forces a question about history. How do societies choose to remember when we memorialize a collective trauma whose story gets centered, the emperor who ordered it, the engineers, or the nameless laborer whose life ended within it? National myth-making tends toward the broad stroke. It seeks symbols that unify, that inspire a shared sense of purpose. The painful details of individual sacrifice can complicate that clean narrative, so they are softened, set aside, remembered in separate folkloric spaces, like the legend of Meng Jiangnü. The wall today stands at a crossroads, the official, proud memory of cultural triumph, and the ancient, whispered memory of human cost. To walk its stones is to walk that line. You feel the awe of its scale, the wind that's blown for centuries, and if you listen closely in that same wind, you might hear echoes of another story. One written not in history books but in the very material of the place, which leads you to look closer, not at the grand vistas but at the stones themselves. To search for the physical traces, the quiet marks left by the hands that put them there. A single brick can hold a memory. You find these voices in the vast silence of the wall. Archaeology finds them not in grand chronicles but in the objects left behind. A worn-out shoe, its leather cracked from 1,000 miles of walking. A simple wooden gaming piece smoothed by fingers during a moment of rest. A broken pottery bowl that once held a ration of grain. These fragments are direct connections. They're tangible. They pull the abstract scale of suffering down to a human level. To hold one of these objects is to touch the daily reality of a life. A life spent on the frontier. Perhaps the most poignant finds are the tools. An iron pickaxe head, its edge dulled and chipped from striking stone. A wooden rammer handle, worn smooth where hands gripped it. These weren't ceremonial items. They were extensions of the body itself. The wear patterns tell a story of repetitive, exhausting motion. They speak of blisters and calluses, of muscles pushed to their limit day after day. When researchers analyze these tools, they can sometimes reconstruct the specific tasks, how a certain chisel was used to shape a cornerstone, how a particular hoe was for digging trenches. Each tool is a silent witness, a witness to a specific kind of toil. Then there are the small, personal items. They hint at a life beyond labor, dice carved from bone, a simple flute made from a reed. These speak to a universal human need, a need for distraction, for community, for a brief escape. In the barracks at night, by the dim light of a fire, men might have gathered for a game, or someone might have played a familiar tune, a sound that carried memories of home across the darkness. These objects are heartbreaking. They reveal the persistence of ordinary life. Even in the most dehumanizing conditions, people sought moments of normalcy. Moments of play, of shared humanity, but the most direct voices come from the wall itself, from epigraphy, the study of inscriptions. On some bricks and stones, particularly from the Ming Dynasty, you find characters stamped or carved. Often they are administrative. They record the military unit responsible for that section, the name of a commanding officer, the date of production. This was a system of accountability, a way for the central administration to track work and quality. Yet sometimes, amidst these official stamps, something more personal appears. A brick might bear the names of the individual laborers who made it, or the name of a craftsman. This is incredibly rare. A fleeting moment where an individual asserted his identity against the anonymity of the project. To press your name into wet clay, to fire it into permanence, was to say, I was here, I made this. In a system that sought to turn men into numbers, this was a quiet act of defiance. A claim to a legacy beyond being merely a spent resource. Archaeology also tells us about their physical well-being through less direct means. Analysis of ancient garbage pits near construction sites reveals a bleak diet. Remains of millet dominate. It's a hardy but low-nutrient grain. Animal bones are rare. They show evidence of being boiled repeatedly for broth that suggests every scrap of nourishment was extracted. This physical evidence confirms the written accounts, the accounts of perpetual hunger. The bones of the laborers themselves, when found, show the stresses of their lives. Signs of osteoarthritis from constant heavy lifting, healed fractures that may have occurred from falls or accidents. The skeletal record is a biological testament. A testament to a life of extreme hardship. These fragments, from a worn shoe to a named brick, perform a crucial function. They challenge the monument's silence. They force us to remember that the wall is not an abstract feat. It is the accumulated result, the result of millions of individual days of labor. Each scratch on a tool, each game piece lost in the dust represents a person. A person with a story that history otherwise forgot. They sought not just to survive the physical ordeal, but to preserve some shred of their identity within it. And for some, that search for meaning extended into the spiritual realm, seeking comfort in beliefs that transcended their immediate suffering. The need for meaning is as strong as the need for food. Out there in the dust, in the noise of the worksite, where a life could feel like a broken tool, something to be thrown away, these laborers reached for something. Something past the physical grind. They turned inward to the spirit. Folk beliefs mixed with Buddhism, mixed with Taoism. That mix gave them a framework. A way to see their suffering, not as random cruelty, but as part of a cosmic order. Karma, for example, you could see your pain as having a purpose. If you endured it with patience, that might build merit. For a better life later, or for your family, Taoist ideas, harmony with nature, yielding to the flow, that could become a strategy, a way to survive a system that would not bend. By aligning yourself with these ideas, you could find a little peace, a sense that your struggle fit into a larger scheme, even if that scheme was invisible to the overseer, to the whip. This spirituality, it wasn't just quiet thought. It showed up in small rituals. A man might carve a charm from a piece of wood. He might whisper a prayer to a local earth god before moving a huge stone, asking the spirit of that place for a little mercy. These acts, they were moments of agency. In a world where they controlled nothing, they could control this. This small connection to the divine, it was a way to make their toil sacred, to imagine a presence that saw them as people, not just labor, and the belief in an afterlife, in rebirth, that changed how they saw death. The high chance of dying out there on the frontier, that was softened by the idea it wasn't an end, it was a transition. Their spirit would journey on. Maybe even return to the homeland they missed in a new form. It didn't erase the hardship, but it made the unthinkable a little more bearable, a refuge built from faith, not stone. But for some, the weight of injustice was too much. Spiritual solace couldn't ease it all. When the body and spirit are pushed too far, the response can turn. From enduring inside to defying outside, the same conditions that created deep belief could also create its opposite, rebellion. This resistance had many forms. From small to large, the most common was probably passive, working slow, pretending to be sick, misunderstanding orders, doing poor work on purpose so it would have to be fixed later. Silent protests, a way to take back a tiny bit of control by withholding your full self. It was a gamble taken over and over. Then there was sabotage. A stone placed poorly so it would shift later, a crucial tool that goes missing, a section of earth secretly weakened, dangerous acts, punishable by death if you were caught. The goal wasn't to destroy the project. One person couldn't do that. It was to disrupt the efficiency, to add friction to the machine. It was a statement. I am here and I can make your task harder. And on rare, volatile occasions, this discontent boiled over. Open rebellion, desperate, usually doomed, a group of laborers pushed past breaking by a brutal overseer or cut rations would rise up. Overpower the guards, seize supplies, flee into the wilderness. The goal wasn't to march on the capital. It was just to escape, to vanish into the mountains or the steppe and try to live as outlaws. These revolts were almost always crushed. Imperial troops would hunt them down, make a brutal example, but the fact they happened at all, that's a testament to a spirit that refused to be completely put out. A final, tragic assertion of the will to live on your own terms, so you have this duality, the search for spiritual solace and the spark of physical rebellion. One path tries to transcend the suffering, to find meaning inside it. The other tries to reject it outright, to fight the source. Both are responses to the same profound lack of agency. And in a kind of poignant twist, the state learned to co-opt this resilience. Later on, legends grew, guardian spirits watching over the wall, temples built near the passes. The story slowly shifted, from the wall as a site of human sacrifice to a site protected by divine will. The spiritual yearning of the laborers over centuries got woven into the wall's own myth. Their search for meaning was absorbed, made part of the monument's eternal story, blurring the line even further between the builders and the built, that absorption into a national myth. It leaves a haunting question about legacy, about memory. How do you honor a sacrifice so vast it became a kind of foundational silence? The supply line was the empire's lifeline, and it was always strained. Think about a cart loaded with millet. It leaves a granary in the south, headed for a mountain outpost 1,000 miles north. The journey itself was a battle. Wooden wheels on rough trails, fording rivers with no bridges. Summer heat could ferment the grain inside the sacks. Autumn rains could dampen them, sprouting mold. A broken axle could strand a caravan for days, the cargo spoiling. And then there were the threats that moved, bandits drawn to a rich, slow target. Or local officials who might skim a portion, calling it theft or spoilage. By the time that cart arrived, what was left was often a fraction of what started. The system was bleeding at every joint. This wasn't bad luck. It was a design flaw born of distance and indifference. The imperial court set the quotas, demanding a certain length of wall. They allocated grain from central stores, but the distance between the decision-makers and the worksite created a vacuum filled with corruption and desperation. Officials along the route had their own pressures, families to feed, superiors to bribe. Diverting a few sacks from a shipment bound for nameless laborers seemed a small, safe crime. The men at the end had no recourse, no way to report it. They were dependent on a system that viewed them as its lowest priority. Their hunger was a line item, an expected deficit. So when food did arrive at the frontier camp, it was a grim event. The ration was meager by design, calculated to provide just enough energy for a day of hard labor and no more. Usually a thin porridge of millet, sometimes mixed with wild vegetables or chaff. Meat was an unimaginable luxury, maybe once a year if a supply animal died. The quality was often atrocious, weevils in the grain, mold you had to scrape off, yet this was what sustained them. Men would line up with wooden bowls, watching a thin stream of gruel fall from the ladle. That moment defined their day. A slightly fuller bowl meant a little more strength to face the mountain. A half portion meant a long afternoon of dizziness, fading focus where a misstep could be fatal. The strict rationing had a cruel, logical purpose. It prevented hoarding, but more importantly, it was a tool of control. A hungry man is a compliant man. His world shrinks to the next meal. He lacks the energy for complex thought, for planning, for rebellion. His entire being is focused on survival until the next ladle of porridge. The state maybe unintentionally weaponized scarcity. It kept the workforce docile by keeping it on the edge of starvation. This turned the construction site into a different kind of trap. Not just a place of dangerous labor, but a place where the basic mechanism of life, the delivery of food, was fundamentally unreliable. A conscript was sent to the frontier to build, but he often found himself in a fight for calories. A fight many lost. Their legal status sealed their fate. For convicts and conscripted peasants, they weren't soldiers entitled to a soldier's ration. They were units of labor, assets to be used until depleted. Their value was in their output, not their well-being. The system's neglect was consistent with that standing. They were at the bottom. The logistics chain reflected that brutal truth. Food would be diverted to garrison troops first. Medicine, if any, would go to officers. The laborer was the last to receive and the first to go without. This systemic failure meant that for countless individuals, the cause of their final rest wasn't a dramatic accident or a battle. It was the slow, quiet failure of the stomach, a failure written into the logistics from the beginning. It raises a haunting question. In an empire capable of moving mountains of stone, why couldn't it reliably move enough grain to feed the men moving them? The answer lies not in ability, but in priority. A person could just disappear into the legal language of the empire. For a conscripted laborer, a convict, or a prisoner of war, the law didn't see a citizen. It saw a resource. That was the foundation of the whole system. Under imperial legal codes, these people were in a category outside normal society. They were classified as property of the state or of the military commanders in charge. Their personhood was legally suspended for their service, which was often for life. This wasn't an oversight, it was the design. By stripping them of legal standing, the state removed any obligation to treat them with dignity. The law became a tool for dehumanization, a shield for those who wielded the whip. There's the legal concept of fa. In the legalist philosophy that influenced the kin, law wasn't about protecting individual rights. It was an instrument of state control, a mechanism to ensure order and mobilize people for the ruler's goals. A labor conscript fell under this framework not as a person with claims, but as a unit obligated to fulfill a duty. His body was temporarily requisitioned by the state, like grain from a storehouse. Any resistance to that wasn't a personal grievance, it was a crime against the state itself. A disruption of the order, the punishment for that was severe and public and meant to terrify others back into line. This legal limbo had practical consequences. Because a laborer wasn't a legal person in the full sense, he had no right to appeal mistreatment. He couldn't bring a complaint against an overseer for excessive punishment. He couldn't dispute his rations. He had no access to any court. His word carried no legal weight against an official's. This created an environment where abuse could flourish without check. An overseer knew his actions, as long as they produced results, wouldn't be questioned. The only limit was his own capacity for cruelty or his fear of slowing progress. Accountability was a fiction. The law had already decided who mattered and who did not. When a laborer died, the response was clinical. His death wasn't a tragedy to be investigated. It was a logistical event, an administrative matter. A foreman would note the loss in a tally, reducing the number of active workers. A report might be sent up the chain, not to mourn, but to request a replacement. The individual was reduced to a subtraction, a vacancy to be filled by the next conscript marching north. There were no inquests into whether malnutrition or a beating contributed to it. No family was notified through official channels. His legal non-existence in life extended into his anonymous departure. This reveals the cold calculus. The suffering wasn't an accidental byproduct of a tough job. It was an anticipated outcome in a system built on disposable human capital. The laws governing forced labor weren't broken to enable this treatment. They were followed. The system functioned as designed, consuming lives as a routine input for a geopolitical output. The wall needed to be built to secure the border, to project imperial power. The legal fiction of the non-person laborer was the grease that let that machine run. It allowed the state to achieve its ambitions while insulating itself from the human cost. Understanding this shifts the perspective from random cruelty to systemic, sanctioned exploitation. It shows why appeals to mercy or fairness were meaningless on the frontier. They had no legal footing. The laborer's value was purely functional, and when that function ended, the system erased him from the worksite and from its own memory. That institutional erasure is perhaps the final form of the cost. It ensured the policy could continue for centuries, because the policy itself had already decided the people it consumed were not really people at all. They were a renewable and expendable resource. The wall is still there, but whether it worked, that's harder to say. It was built to secure the empire from the north. But it wasn't just a barricade. Its purpose changed over the centuries. As a military barrier, the record is mixed. It was never completely impenetrable. Better to think of it as a filter. For small raiding parties, it was a serious obstacle. The height, the watchtowers, they had to find a gate or a remote section to get through. That slowed them down. It gave the garrisons time to respond. It made raids much harder. It channeled movement into choke points. In that role, it worked. It was a deterrent, a force multiplier, but it had limits. When a large, organized force came like the Mongols under Genghis Khan, the wall wasn't enough. They didn't just scale it, they found weaknesses, they besieged fortresses, they went around it. The wall couldn't stop a tidal wave. Other major incursions happened. It wasn't a magic shield, it was a tool. Its success depended on who was using it and who they were facing, and it had other functions, strategic ones. It was an economic control point. All trade between the steppes and the farmland had to go through its gates that let the government tax goods, control the flow of materials, horses, metals. Monitor who was coming and going. It turned the border into an administrative frontier. It was also a military highway. Troops and supplies could move quickly along its walkways. Faster than through open territory, a backbone for logistics. So the question remains, given these mixed results, a filter, not an absolute barrier, were the sacrifices worth it? That's an ethical calculation. From the state's perspective, maybe. The constant cost of maintaining the wall was weighed against the catastrophic risk of an invasion. An invasion that could topple a dynasty. The wall bought time, it controlled passage, it projected power, a long-term investment in stability, paid for with a generation's suffering. Strategically, for many emperors, the answer was yes, but strategic necessity isn't moral justification. From the view of the laborer dying in a ditch or the family starving without their farmer, the calculation means nothing. Their loss was absolute, personal, not a line in a ledger. Can any abstract idea of collective security legitimize the consumption of millions of lives? That's the tension, the needs of the state against the rights of the person, collective destiny against individual fate. This debate echoes elsewhere. The pyramids of Egypt, built by conscripted labor for a pharaoh's afterlife. The Roman roads, built by legions and slaves to bind an empire. The grand cathedrals of medieval Europe. Rising over the toil of generations, monumental projects that define civilizations, they're often shadowed by the same question. When a society builds its symbols of unity and power, who bears the cost? Does the glory of the finished monument, centuries later, justify the means of its creation? The Great Wall offers no easy answer, only the weight of the question. Built into every stone, and now when we look at it, that weight makes us wonder, how is the memory of that sacrifice preserved, or is it quietly paved over by tourists and time? That same shadow appears elsewhere with other ancient wonders. The Great Wall is a clear example, but it's not the only one. You see this pattern again and again. Across different places, different centuries, whenever a civilization tried to build its legacy in stone, it usually rested on a foundation of human struggle. Take the Egyptian pyramids. They rise from the desert as tombs for pharaohs, but their construction needed a huge labor force, likely a mix of skilled workers and seasonal conscripts. Farmers taken from their land during the Nile's flood season. They weren't slaves in the chattel sense, but they were compelled by religious duty, by state power, to work for decades, moving multi-ton blocks with ramps and levers, just immense collective effort. The mortality rate in that environment, with primitive tools and constant strain, would have been high. Just a silent, accepted part of the project. Then there's the Roman Empire, its famous roads, aqueducts, amphitheaters. These were the sinews of its power. They enabled trade, military movement, control. That infrastructure was built by the hands of legions, soldiers who are also engineers and laborers, and by vast numbers of enslaved people captured in Rome's endless wars. The Appian Way, the Colosseum, they're marvels of engineering, but their stones hold the effort of those who had no choice. The human cost was institutional, woven right into the fabric of a society built on conquest and servitude. Move forward to more modern projects. The pattern changes in legal form, but often persists in spirit. The Panama Canal in the early 20th century, a triumph of modern engineering over geography, but the first attempt by the French was a humanitarian disaster. Tens of thousands of workers succumbing to tropical diseases, yellow fever, malaria, horrific conditions. Even the successful American effort, with better medical science, relied heavily on a segregated labor force. Workers from the Caribbean facing harsh conditions and real risk. The canal stands as a gateway between oceans, but its banks hold the memory of a staggering loss of life. So what connects these projects from the pyramids to the canal? It's a recurring calculus, a calculus of ambition. A ruling power, a pharaoh, an emperor, a modern state envisions something transformative. It promises eternal glory, strategic advantage, economic supremacy. The vision becomes so compelling that the means to achieve it turn secondary. Labor, the vital resource, gets mobilized not through voluntary partnership but through coercion. Conscription, slavery, economic desperation. The individual's life, health, freedom, it all gets subsumed into the collective goal. The project's timeline and grandeur outweigh the welfare of the people building it. This view doesn't diminish the specific tragedy of the Great Wall. It frames it. It shows that the wall's story is part of a much older, recurring human narrative. The drive to leave a permanent mark on the world, to defy time and nature, has often carried a terrible moral price. It forces a reflection. Many landmarks we cherish today as cultural heritage, as testaments to human ingenuity, were born from systems of profound inequality and suffering. So when we admire these monuments now, we're presented with a dual legacy. We see the awe-inspiring achievement, the imagination and skill, and we also sense, if we choose to look, the echo of the countless unnamed individuals whose toil made it possible. This duality asks us to hold a more complete history, to honor the engineering without erasing the human cost, to understand that human progress is rarely a simple triumph. It's often a complex mosaic of brilliance and sacrifice. That broader perspective makes the quiet voices from the Great Wall's stones not an isolated whisper, but part of a chorus that has echoed through all of recorded time. That duality goes with you when you visit. The Great Wall is a UNESCO site now, a global symbol. You see it on postcards, in movies. It stands for endurance, for national pride. For China today, it's a link to a glorious past. Kids learn about the engineering, the strategy, the sheer will it took to build. That story is powerful and it's true, but the human foundation of it, that's often quieter, a more complex lesson. The official story and the folk memory run side by side, and they don't always meet. Tourism makes that tension clear. Millions go to Badaling or Mushunyu every year. They climb, they take pictures, they feel the achievement. The experience is set up for grandeur. Signs tell you about the architecture, the dynasties, the military use. It's easy to be swept up in the awe, but if you stop and you look closer, the stones make you ask other things. You touch a brick, feel the uneven surface, the chips from centuries of weather. Whose hands made this? Who lifted it here? The silence of the structure starts to feel different. It feels full. That beautiful view rests on a foundation of immense effort, and knowing that changes the beauty. It becomes a summer kind of wonder. Some people seek out the wild sections where the wall is crumbling and overgrown. There, the past feels less managed. The hardship of building it, the loneliness of guarding it, that feels closer. No souvenir stalls, just whined and decaying stone. That kind of engagement is more introspective. It lets the sorrow in right alongside the splendor. For a moment, the monument isn't just a sight to see. It's a story to feel in all its difficulty. Media usually picks a side. Epic films show the armies, the emperors, the grand scale of history. The laborer is just part of the scenery. It's not malicious, it's a narrative choice, but it keeps the anonymity. On the other hand, the legend of Meng Jiangnü survives in operas and local tales. It keeps the emotional counter-narrative alive. The voice of loss isn't completely silenced, even if it's folklore, not a textbook lesson. That leads to a bigger question. How do societies remember world wonders that came from profound suffering? The Colosseum, the pyramids, the Taj Mahals, so many iconic places have this hidden layer. Their beauty is tied to histories of coercion and sacrifice. The usual approach is to separate the two, to spotlight the engineering triumph while the human cost stays in the shadows. A footnote: we admire the product, but we politely look away from the process. Is that complete remembrance? To really honor a place's legacy, don't we have to honor the full truth of how it was made? This isn't about swapping pride for guilt. It's not about ruining a visit with grief. It's about letting your understanding hold more than one truth at once. It's acknowledging that greatness and grief can be woven into the same stone. Looking beyond the picturesque isn't an endpoint. It's a beginning. It's the step you have to take before you can ask the most important question. If these silent stones could speak not about emperors or battles, but about the individuals who became part of them, what would they want us to know? What's the legacy of those who built the wall, not as a nation, but as people? Their story asks you to listen for a different kind of echo in the wind. A debt hangs around those ancient stones, a debt of remembrance for the millions whose names are lost, whose stories were never written down. We can't undo the past, we can't give back the years, but how we choose to remember, that's a form of justice, a way to restore some dignity, to say they weren't just a cost. They were people. The wall itself is their monument, but its meaning has shifted. It celebrates imperial achievement, collective will, engineering genius. The individual gets lost in that grand sweep. So the question is the monument enough? Or does its triumphant story bury the sacrifice all over again? This time under layers of national pride. That's where modern efforts come in, trying to balance the scales. Scholars, archaeologists, artists working to recover those lost voices. Not to take away from the wall's grandeur, but to complete it, to put the human dimension back into the story. This recovery takes many forms. Historians now look at grain receipts, garrison logs, administrative documents. They're not just looking for emperors' names, they're looking for clues about daily life, the small data, the amount of millet per man. Records of tool replacements, reports of illness in a camp. From these dry fragments, they rebuild the environment of the frontier, the systemic pressures that shaped those lives. It's a kind of forensic empathy, using the bureaucracy's own records to show the human reality it often ignored. Archaeological digs don't just map fortifications anymore. They sift through garbage pits, they examine barracks, they look for personal items, a worn leather shoe, a gaming die, a broken comb. These aren't treasures in the traditional sense. But they are a different kind of treasure, a direct connection to an individual. Each find is a quiet rebuttal to anonymity. It says, a person was here. This belonged to someone. Artistic interpretation plays a role here too. Contemporary artists create works that make the scale of loss felt. Installations with thousands of clay figures representing laborers. Soundscapes mixing the wind on the stones with whispered names, the rhythmic sound of digging. These works don't argue with history, they make you feel its weight. They create a space to contemplate the individual, not just the collective. They're acts of memorial where no physical tomb exists. Even in popular media, a shift is happening. Documentaries and smaller narratives are asking, what was it like to be the person carrying the stone? This changes the wall. It stops being just a backdrop for great men. It becomes a stage for ordinary humanity. Remembering the human cost isn't about guilt. It's about historical completeness. It acknowledges that our awe for the monument is only half the story. The full story has the hand that drew the plan and the hands that blistered building it. To honor only one is to see a silhouette, not the full person. By trying to remember the builders, we change the wall. It stops being just an inert structure of stone and earth. It becomes a testament to the full human experience. To our capacity for breathtaking ambition and heartbreaking sacrifice, for monumental endurance and profound fragility. It's a record of what we can build and a reminder of what that building can cost. This dual understanding doesn't weaken the wall's legacy, it deepens it, it adds meaning, moral gravity. It lets us hold both truths at once, the triumph and the tragedy, and in doing that, see a more complete picture of our own history. The stones are silent, but our remembrance can give them a voice, and in that voice, maybe, lies the start of repaying that ancient debt. That contradiction is the final piece of the story. We've gone from imperial ambition to the quiet despair of a laborer's last day. The cost took so many forms, the physical toll of endless work, the emotional rupture of families left behind. The silent anonymity of a burial inside the ramparts themselves. This history doesn't take away from the wall's grandeur, it complicates it. It asks you to hold two truths at once. To marvel at the achievement and to honor the profound sacrifice it required. The structure becomes more than a fortification. It's a testament to the human spirit in its most extreme forms. Our breathtaking capacity to shape the world, and our heartbreaking willingness to expend lives in the process. So the Great Wall stands as a permanent question in the landscape. What price are we willing to pay for security, for legacy, for an idea of greatness that lasts beyond a single lifetime? Every society in every era faces some version of that. The ancient builders on the frontier faced it in the most immediate, brutal terms. Their story asks us to look critically at the foundations of our own monuments. The literal ones and the figurative ones, whose labor makes our stability possible, whose silent contribution makes our symbols. So the next time you see an image of those snaking battlements against a mountain, see more than stone. See the layered story, let your mind trace the line of the wall, but also listen for the whispers inside it. The whispers of the individual hands that placed each brick. The hopes and the hardships woven into its fabric. This knowledge doesn't ruin the wonder, it deepens it with humanity. It turns a distant monument into an intimate connection across centuries. A somber one, but a connection. History is rarely a simple tale of triumph or tragedy. It's a mosaic of both, and they're often inseparable. By seeking out these fuller, more challenging narratives, we do more than learn about the past. We build a more compassionate understanding of our shared human journey.